go back to France, to where the Acadians came from before they sailed to the New World. So we did that. And as it happened, we met a group of French-speaking historians in Paris, and they said, "Oh, wonder of wonders, we're having a banquet tonight, and we have no Americans representing the Acadians. Would you like to come to the banquet?" And so, wow, it was a banquet in which people were dressed in period costumes and big trays of food. It was very exciting. So we went in, and they sat us at the head table. Why? Why me? So Geneviève was this beautiful woman. She was a fisherwoman. She spoke beautiful French, and she said, "Marie Thérèse, you have to say a few words in French if you're going to sit at the head table." Now, my French is what we call a patois. So it's a mixture of French words from Canada, from Louisiana, from my mother's collection of old French words. And and the room was filled with 350 people. It was packed. Now, in Paris, everyone is very prim and proper. They were dressed to the nines. It was something to see, looking out at them. And my knees were knocking, and I stood up because I was expected to say something. So I wanted to say, "It's wonderful to be here tonight amongst your smiling faces." Because when I looked out, that's what I saw, a room full of beautiful smiling faces. But I used the wrong French word. And what I said to those wonderful people, "It's wonderful to be here tonight amongst your smiling asses." And they started laughing. Well, it turns out that the Parisian French use the word visage to talk about a face. The Canadian French, we say belle face. And this part of your anatomy is belle fesse. So it was a very simple, anyway, I came home and I decided that I wanted to write a book about my grandmother. And I called it My Grandmother's Face, or Le Visage de ma Grand-Mère. And in this book, it documents 10 women with their recipes that have been passed down by word of mouth. It documents the Acadian deportation, and it has some wonderful maps that now have been, my little book is now in this very prestigious map collection in Portland, Maine, the Osler collection of maps. Anyway, I just put that, I brought one copy in case anyone would like to take a look at it. It's here. So, And Poison Fell from the Sky is a memoir. So it's my recollection of living in my hometown and dealing with things that I felt were nondescript. You know, when you talk about how you can smell it, you don't stop and say, what can I do about that smell? How big is that smell? I mean, it permeates the entire town. And so I'm going to read you a few things just to give you a feel for, is that me making all that noise?
I think it's just when you hit it against something.
When I hit it.
Yeah.
So, on most Saturday mornings, my best friend Catherine and I walked to downtown Rumford. We tried to avoid breathing fumes from the paper mill by turning our walk into a game we called Don't Breathe. When one of us caught the rotten egg smell in the air, we'd yell, "Don't breathe!" And the two of us would run, holding our breath until we thought we'd gone far enough that the air had cleared. With an experimental sniff, if the smell was gone, we'd say, "All clear." It was fun, and we giggled our way downtown, play acting exaggerated distress whenever the smell hit our noses. But we also knew, I think, that it wasn't really a game. If we took a deep breath, the caustic fumes made our chests burn. On some level, we realized that breathing the mill exhaust wasn't good for us, so we found a way to protect ourselves by making it into a game. So I chose that passage because for us, it was a bit of an epiphany. It was a moment in time when we became aware that something was amiss. Something was there that shouldn't be. We were 12. They call that an aha moment, a moment when we're suddenly struck with a life-changing realization which ends up changing the rest of your life. So if something, if you become aware of something and you walk past it, that's one thing. But if you become aware of something and you find a way to challenge it, that can change your life. And it changed our life. On an inescapable hot and humid night in the early 1970s, the air felt so thick in my bedroom that it was hard to breathe. Even though I shut and locked the windows in our drafty old house, pungent odors from the nearby Rumford paper mill always managed to work their way inside. The rotten egg smell seemed particularly strong in the wee hours of quiet summer nights along the polluted Androscoggin River. But it was just a bad smell, right? The smell of money, right? It is the smell that the mill bosses always told us, the smell of money. Suddenly my husband sat bolt upright in bed, sweat dripping from his forehead. "What's the matter?" I asked, still half asleep, but fearing an urgent problem, either personal or with a patient. Doc and I, physician and registered nurse, operated a family medical practice in an office attached to our house. It was somewhat quaint, and our regular patients usually had stories to tell. Pretty typical in a small community in the 70s. But increasingly, it seemed their stories were about cancer. Who had it? Who might have it? Who died? And maybe details about the next fundraiser to help a cancer family in need. Doc was a man with dark secrets who could be terrifying behind closed doors. He was also remarkably compassionate, a professional and a relentlessly curious soul. It bothered him, and he couldn't figure it all out until this moment. Water, air, chemicals, unregulated dumping, cancer, disease, they're all connected, he blurted out. We didn't fall back to sleep. We talked until the sun rose over what, just a few years later, the media would dub Cancer Valley. Doc's middle-of-the-night revelation would forever change and at times nearly destroy our lives. The issue and the debate eventually prompted one of the most famous cancer hospitals in the world to call Doc and ask him straight out, "What the hell's going on in Rumford?" For me and my hometown, the answer to that question was a long and painful journey. This is my story. That's how my story starts. Now, for those of you who've read Milltown, Milltown is a fabulous book. It's a big book, has a lot of technical and chemical information in it, Carrie Arsenault is an investigative journalist who came from the Rumford area. Her dad died of cancer. Probably her grandmother and her aunts and uncles. Most everybody dies from cancer. It is a very sobering diagnosis. Carrie used myself and my husband as characters in her book to tell part of her story. And I felt compelled when I read her book to tell my own story, which is why I wrote my memoir. I couldn't honestly tell a story about a town that had abusive ways, a paper mill that was abusing the people that lived as neighbors. There were issues with the church, there were issues with the town. It was a very complicit melting pot of many kinds of, I'm being careful now with my
We can cut out anything we need to, Terry, from
It just felt like the town was complicit with the mill. The mill was complicit with the church. The church was complicit with the I mean, it just went around in a circle. And if something unusual was going to happen anywhere in the world, it was going to happen in Rumford. That's the way we felt about it. So Carrie wrote her book, and Rumford, Maine got the attention of the New York Times and a major publisher, and a lot of interesting spin-offs have occurred since she's written her book. I'll tell you an interesting one, I think, is that she invited the characters from her book to go to Harvard University, where she was teaching a course in environmental studies. So I packed my little bag and I went to Harvard. Now, if you had asked me or told me that this would be the year that I would speak at Harvard, I would have never have believed that would happen. But there I was, as a character in the book, in front of an environmental studies class filled with young, hopeful students, asking questions that mattered, thinking things into the future. You know, one of the most frequently asked questions is there hope? Is there hope for what's happened, what continues to happen? I don't have an answer for that. I'd like to say that there was no more pollution, that the rivers were clean, but they're not. Okay. So, what Carrie kindly wrote the foreword to the book for me, and it was a bit of a strategy. Imagine being on the New York Times bestseller list, and she writes the foreword to my book. It was a bit of a coup. I didn't think of it, but I wished I had. Someone else thought of it and made it happen. This is what she said about me. Terry Martin. So it's confusing sometimes because I use my French name, which is Marie Thérèse Martin. My mother called me Marie Thérèse. Both of my grandmothers thought, what a terrible name for a baby. So they started calling me Terry. And Terry stuck. But by using my French name and being sort of a very gentle soul, I don't have to, I can pretend that this is not me. When I go to Rumford, I wear a wig. No. I'm kidding. I thought of going to Rumford in a wig, but I haven't done that. So here's what Carrie says. Terry Martin grew up in a western Maine town, rooted in the framework and faith of two institutions, the paper mill and the church. These powerful pillars of community life were models of deference and obedience, providing structure and income, and preaching about a greater good. But as she became an adult, the soaring cancer rates and domestic abuse she witnessed forced her to question long-standing truths and begin a decades-long fight to expose the devil's bargain struck by her community. In her compelling memoir, Martin struggles with the push and pull between truth and survival, both in her exploration of the mill's pollution and in her own marriage, and strives to find her voice in a world where narratives are dominated by the powerful and where turning a blind eye is easier than publicly demanding change. I think that's the most important sentence that she writes here. Turning a blind eye rather than demanding change. My book has some interesting things because I thought they were interesting. I went to nursing school. I was in the nunnery. I decided after nursing school that I would travel in Europe on $5 a day. Can you believe it? Do you remember that time? No. So I went traveling with another nurse, and we were gone for 2 months. And I had $1,000 in my pocket now. How much is that a day, Forrest? $5. It was tricky, but we did it. We only ate one meal a day, but that's all we needed. When I did come back to Rumford, I got it in my head to see my hometown from the perspective of the Androscoggin River, something I'd never done before. I don't know where I got the idea to do this, but I talked my younger brother into borrowing a canoe and paddling down the river with me. Come on, I said, let's borrow a canoe so we can go out on the Androscoggin River. It was a beautiful Saturday, and I was determined. I don't think Mom would let us go, my brother said. He was cautious and didn't want to upset anyone. Well, let's not tell her then, I said. He finally gave in, and we found ourselves in a red canoe, sitting in the middle of the river with no idea what we were doing. Being out on the Androscoggin River gave me a broader and darker view of my town and the paper-making industry. It was an awakening that caught me off guard. I didn't know our beautiful river was being used as a sewer by every community and mill along its 160-mile length. I saw old pipes discharging smelly brown wastewater. It was puzzling to see such rich green foliage arching along the riverway, and yet have the offensive stink of rotten egg gas assaulting our noses. As we paddled along the river, toilet paper hung on the oars, and floating tin cans and tires bumped the canoe's hull. The river was, in effect, a landfill and a toxic waste dump, all in one. One of my oars got tangled in an old trench coat. I wondered if a body was floating below the murky, foam-flecked surface. Like Lewis and Clark, we were traveling into a world of unfamiliar to us, except the water we were crossing was poisoned and dirty. The industrial end product looked like foam and collected in all the small inlets along the way as it crept its way downriver, dragged along by the current from one town to the next. One Maine farmer described this toxic foam as too thick to paddle and too thin to plow. It was the 60s, still years away, when Senator Edmund Muskie would spearhead the groundbreaking Clean Water Act which passed in 1972. Like me, Muskie grew up in Rumford, and he already knew the environmental damage my brother and I were discovering that Saturday morning. My brother and I vowed to return to the river with a barge to collect the debris left behind, but we never did. Still, I would never forget this perspective or my day on the river. That is another story. That foam, I don't know if any, you probably saw it when you were there. It was an interesting way to describe it. Too thick to shovel and too thin to plow. Yeah, luckily we don't see that anymore. But I'm still worried about the things that we don't see. There's a lot of that. Don't fall asleep now. If you do, I'm going to start singing. I kind of liked this description. I wrote it and I liked it. That's a good sign, isn't it, John? If you write something and you like it. We lived in what some called a granite bowl, thinking the mountains protected us. And maybe they did, but they also kept us trapped. The mountains that surrounded my town were covered with lush green forests and tributaries that flowed to merge with the Androscoggin River. I don't know if you saw on the news the other night, this young English man, his last name was Pugh, I thought that was appropriate. He swam the length of the Hudson River, 330 some odd miles. And he said, our rivers are like the veins and the arteries in the body. And if you don't keep them clean, they're all going down to the ocean. And as badly as the rivers are, the ocean is fast becoming the same kind of a mess. In the struggle between industry and healthy, livable land, the balance in my town always tipped in favor of the industry. The geography of the area made it a bad location for a growing population and a polluting industry to coexist. Everything that came out of the stacks was held in by the mountains and eventually, inevitably, fell back into the valley in one form or another. The stink, the noise, the caustic air made life untenable for some, uncomfortable for all. But in a one-industry town, there's nowhere for a workforce to pivot. Even if you come to discover the work that feeds you may also be killing you, there's little choice but to keep doing it. What choice did they have? They had to feed their kids. They had a good insurance plan. You hope that you're one of the lucky ones who successfully tiptoes through the acid rain, or you deny what you know altogether. Those who made paper and depended on the weekly paychecks used bluster to cover up what they suspected, what their bodies must have told them at some level. Breathe it in. It's the smell of money. The mill bosses would repeat this, and the workers repeated the same phrase so often they believed it too. As the paper industry grew, it wasn't prepared for and didn't foresee a time when it would overtake the entire green space in the valley. Have any of you been to Rumford? You have. You have. You have. You've been there. It's a beautiful town. But in the bottom of that bowl, it takes up almost all of the green space of that area. There were and remain, of course, plenty of faithful defenders of the paper mill who claimed they were used to the smell. They were used to the smell. Didn't bother them. By and large, we trusted and believed everything around us was safe. We were controlled by the paper mill, conditioned to be obedient by the Catholic Church and taught to keep our mouths shut by our families. In many ways, it was an unholy trinity. I don't want to be the one that puts you to sleep, so, but there is, do you have any questions for me at this point? Yes,
How many years did the mill operate?
it's still operating. It started, I think it started, and I was gonna make that a study, but it was it felt like such a negative thing. It was bad enough to tell my story. But there's a lot written about the mill. I mean, it started out as a very wonderful thing, you know, a very paternalistic kind of valley. Housing was provided. They built a hospital so people could be taken care of right within that valley. They gave turkeys for Thanksgiving, T-shirts for the 4th of July. They did some good things there, but I never felt in my exchanges with them that they wanted to be honest about, you know, when the word dioxin first came out in the 70s and they found out that it was in paper mill sludge, they didn't want to talk about that. That was not something that was part of the discussion of anything. Well, it was the same problem with Agent Orange. They did not want to talk about dioxin. In Agent Orange, they did not want to open up that can of worms. Don't leave me yet. My favorite chapter. You ready for this one? It'll tell you the dark downturn I've taken in my lifetime here. It's called the multiple contamination principle. Question: which of these chemicals was I exposed to just because I lived near the mill? How many chemicals do you think we're exposed to?
All of them.
Yeah.
But just guess. 2, 5.
Hundreds.
Tens of thousands,
Oh. Could be. Could be.
just in daily life we are.
Just in daily life we are. But we're not exposed to dioxin in daily life. Unless you travel near a paper mill.
Or had it spread on your fields, 'cause it
Or
was
had
in-
it spread on your field
Oh.
and your food. So, which of these chemicals was I exposed to just because I lived near the mill? Dioxin, chloroform, ammonia, formaldehyde. I think this would make a great rap song. All of these, somebody needs to do that. Carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, nitrates, ethanol, benzene is a good one, volatile organic compounds, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, elemental chlorine, chlorine gas, hydrogen chloride, hydrogen fluoride, cadmium, diesel, gasoline, hydrocarbons, new source fuel or chip tires, coal and mercury. It may be that one of the issues in my town is that we were in a bowl. So whatever went up fell back down into the town. And there were, you know, no one likes to talk about cancer clusters. That's a bad word. But there were sections of the town that were more, people were more susceptible to multiple myeloma, cancer. We had one case of cancer of the heart. That's a little rare. I never heard of that, but. So, which are you exposed to? You're right, all of them. Many studies are done on individual chemicals that are toxic or carcinogenic, but there's not much data about the effect of a cocktail mixture like that one. that I was exposed to every day of my life. How would you calculate the possibility of injury from the combined effect of these chemicals on your body? How could you gauge the seriousness of your own exposure? It's probably impossible. But it seems reasonable to assume that if any one of these substances by itself can cause cancer or lung disease, then they would not somehow be magically rendered harmless when combined with each other, right? There were plenty of symptoms of multiple contamination exposure hiding in plain sight, yet the industry was safe from responsibility and liability, as there was no way to demonstrate cause and effect. That has always been the issue. Can you prove that the stuff coming out of that stack is causing your child's cancer of the lung? How do you do that? You can't.
Especially, when not everybody is suffering at the same time and same age.
No. So, getting back to my original question, if every chemical on our list can cause harm, what happens when one compound mixes with another, and still another? How would this toxic chemical cocktail affect my life? What would a relentless wash of chemicals do to vulnerable human tissue as toxins were carried along the bloodstream from one fragile part of the body to the next? Does body mass slow the distribution? So are children in more danger because they have less body mass than a large 200-pound adult? Some considered limited exposure safe. Were they talking about a one-time exposure or a continuous accumulation that occurs over years? No one was calculating or watching. So this is kind of an important thing that I discovered along the way. I'm not surprised nor particularly dismayed that we couldn't count on the mill to protect us. Should we have expected that they would protect us from these chemicals? I mean, they knew what chemicals they were using. Is it my job, the mother of my family, getting dinner ready, doing grocery shopping? Do I have to keep track of what they're dumping in the air and in the river to protect my kids? Who's watching out for that? Well, we expect that the Environmental Protection Agency is doing that to some degree. Well, more important and more difficult to accept is the manner in which the Environmental Protection Agency ignored both the letter and the spirit of the Clean Air Act by leaving pulp mill emissions, highly toxic metals like mercury, organic pollutants like dioxins, and acid gases like hydrogen chloride and hydrogen fluoride unregulated. They're unregulated. They get a free pass. You want to dump mercury? Do it. They're going to do it at night when it's dark and it's under the cover of nightfall. And there are plenty of witnesses to that. That's not something that's made up. People tell those stories. What started in the 1970s when the EPA claimed it was authorized, but not required, to set limits for uncontrolled pollutants, and it was not resolved until 2021. So who's a good math student here? From the early 1970s to 2021, the EPA claimed that they were authorized, but not required. A District of Columbia Court of Appeals decided that the EPA has a mandatory duty under the Clean Air Act to address all toxic air pollutants. It didn't do much good for those of us who lived through 40-plus years when the EPA had that duty but did not fulfill it. Earth Justice is a public interest environmental law organization that, according to its website, quote, wields the power of law and the strength of partnership to protect people's health and to preserve magnificent places and wildlife, to advance clean energy, and to combat climate change. Attorney James Pugh was quoted as saying, "The pollution from the mills is so bad that people living nearby can smell it and can get sick from the fumes. And the long-term effects of exposure on health can be even more serious. Communities near pulp mills badly needed the protection that the Clean Air Act was intended to provide, and it is immoral. Maybe it's both. Could be both. That the EPA tried to shirk its duty to protect people from toxic air pollution. But this is an abstraction. Communities, protection, and even immoral are ultimately bloodless, lifeless words. They don't reveal anything about the actual experience of watching one person after another get sick and die, while you, the person charged with caring for their health, can do next to nothing to help. Here then are some facts. Oh. I'm not going to read all that. I'm going to put you to sleep. But you can buy the book and read all the facts. Let's see. I think we're coming to the end of what I wanted to tell you. Writers write for many reasons. I wanted to write my story, but where I started is not where I ended. The act of writing allowed me to better understand the details of my life that played out in both darkness and light, in private and in public. I think that's probably, how am I doing, John? The time?
It's like 22.
Good. I had one important thing to say that's just gone. Boop. Never feeling. It went out.
It'll come back.
You promise? I know, I just got it, thank you. It was you that brought it back to me. You may not know this, maybe you do. I'd like to know, after I ask you this question, I'd like to know how many of you would tell me that you already knew this. So, in our town, we have football teams, we have cross-country runners, we have all kinds of sports events, and the kids run under the umbrella of those big stacks spewing out every day. And so that was an issue. Before COVID, we didn't think so much about wearing masks. If I had to go back now, my kids would wear they would wear a respirator mask, never mind a plain little, because there were days in my town when you could not see the road. There was such an air inversion, you could not see the road. And that's true in other Milltown communities. But I think ours was particularly difficult because of that granite pole. But here's what's happened now. All of those companies, Boise, Meade, Ethel Corporation, all of those big paper mill companies have sold. First they bought the mill with all the land holdings. Then they sold the land. And then they sold this, and then they sold that. And guess what? Eventually they sold the paper mill. So Rumford is now owned by a company from China. So now we're polluting for China. And they're not the only ones. Several other, I think, other paper mills along our major rivers are all being bought by the Chinese. So when your granddaughter gets cancer of the what, she's a recycling unit for China. That's what we're doing now. We've sold our mills to the Chinese. And some people say, oh, it's better. Those are the same folks, unfortunately, that, they always think it's better. Hey, listen, you've been a great audience, sitting there listening to me.
That's what we do.
It's what you do, yes.
Do you have any idea what percentage of the population has been diagnosed with cancer in Rumford?
You know why that's a really tough question to answer? There is a Bureau of Statistics in the state of Maine. They can give you some of those numbers. But what happens is, you grow up in a small town in Maine, you graduate at 18, and you move to California. Now, you've been exposed for 18 years. Have you been exposed badly, or did you live on the fringes of the town? Did you live under the stacks? How badly did you work in the mill? How badly were you exposed? And so those folks who die in California, they become part of California statistics. They're not part of our state of Maine statistics. And I'm not so well versed in that. This is my story from my point of view. And, but now on the internet, you can find out a lot of those kinds of things. Yes, John?
So what was the reaction of the town when you and your husband, I don't want to spoil too much of the book, started questioning things about the mill and about the safety of the mill?
Oh, we became persona non grata. We were shunned. We were, our lives were made very difficult. He was not allowed to use the hospital. They kept looking for ways to get rid of him. He was a family doctor, born and raised in the town. He's the one that woke up in the middle of the night and said, I solved the problem. I know what the problem is. We're being dosed
Poison.
by all by all of these chemicals. And in that kind of way, he was a very logical, reasonable thinker. And he felt that if he told the story about what was going on, that other reasonable people would say, well, you've got a point there. Let's check it out. No, that's not what happened. They did everything they could to make his life really difficult, and consequently mine too. And part of this is me looking for my ability to forgive them for the difficulty that in the 70s, the Natural Resource Council came to our town in the bottom of the town office. You know what those look like? They're all cement floors with those big iron posts and everyone sitting around. And they were talking about this wonderful stuff. How wonderful was the paper mill going to do for the farmers in Maine? They were going to give you sludge, which is very high in nitrogen. Not only would they give you free nitrogen for your fields, they would deliver it to you. Isn't that nice? Just sign up here. And early on, the Natural Resource Council supported that. We fought it that night. My son, one of my boys who was a chemistry major at Bowdoin College, stood up, and he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He said, are you condoning the spreading of sludge, which is known to have dioxin in it? Are you condoning that on our farms in Maine? And, yes, he said it's harmless, it's not gonna hurt anything. And my son said, "Sir," in the most polite way that he could, "Sir, you are an idiot." And, you know, everyone in the room, but Sir was an idiot. And, you know, looking back, but why don't we learn anything looking forward? We only learn things looking back, saying, gee, if only I had known, I could have done something different. We have a Superfund site in my town. There is a very large landfill. Now, would you think it would be a good idea to put a landfill on top of a mountain? On top of a
Running
mountain?
to a river.
Next to a river? Oh, but the landfill hole, I forget how deep it is, because you know, we forget things after 40. They lined it with Kevlar. Kevlar at the time was the state-of-the-art protective barrier. So you could put anything in Kevlar and it wasn't going to go anywhere. So they lined the inside of the mountain with Kevlar and they dumped paper mill sludge in there year after year. And of course, it got very heavy and the Kevlar ripped and all of that stuff started leaching into the groundwater. And just below the landfill, there was a motel with a restaurant, and their well was not delivering the amount of water that they needed. So they decided to drill a well. So they did, and up came the first batch. It was putrid green, and it had a very bad smell. Well, it was the same when the state looked at it. It was the same chemical composition as the leachate from the landfill. You know what they did? They capped the well and said to the guy, don't you worry, we're going to dig you a new well, we'll drill you a new well, and in the meanwhile, we'll get you bottled water. It was it was like a secret. Don't talk about it. I guess one of the hopeful things, I'm almost done.
My watch was telling me to stand, that's all.
Oh.
Time to stand.
One of my
Forgive me.
kids became an advocate for water. And she worked for 10 years for Riverkeeper, following in Pete Seeger's footsteps to clean up the Hudson River, and she was in charge of water quality on the Hudson River, which sounds like, what do you do with that? You take a little water. No. She commandeered 7 communities along the Hudson River because the Hudson River uses that for their drinking water, some of it. And they closed Indian Point, and the powers that be wanted to dump tritium into the Hudson River. Anyway, she fought that. They're not dumping tritium in the Hudson River. She's commandeered these 7 communities. They call them the Hudson 7. And Mr. Pugh just swam the Hudson River, and he said it was pretty clean. So something is happening, but nothing's happening on the Androscoggin River, unfortunately.
Is it any better at all than it used to be? I
Yes.
mean, there's not
Yes.
tires floating anymore,
No.
but
Yeah, but you can only eat one fish a year, right?
One fish a year. Yeah. If you dare do that.
yeah.
You know, there have been a number of lawsuits. The Native American Wabanakis They have fought for their tribal rights to fish. They had big battles with that. Why we would ever fight that, I don't know. We should all be happy to fish in our rivers and be able to eat the fish. So,
I have a memory I just want to share, and that I was a teacher at Mexico High School, those 10 years. And I would say it was probably 1973 that school got called off just for the high school. Mexico High School had a ramp that connected two buildings. And what had happened is there was a temperature inversion or something that was squeezing
air
down.
inversion.
Well, and it ended up in the ramp having clouds form against the ceilings. It wasn't that tall, but I mean, and it was raining inside the place, and so they had to let us go.
Let you go home.
Yes,
Acid rain.
yes,
Yeah.
hard to believe.
Yeah. Well, I had a report from a teacher in Mexico. One day in, I think it was June, when there was an air inversion. It was one of those hot, sticky days. And she looked up, and quite a few of the kids in the school, in the classroom, were sitting there with bloody noses.
Oh, wow.
But, you know, what can we do besides saying, oh, no? Oh, why? I don't know what we can do. I organized, and in my book I tell you, I went to that landfill with a friend of mine because I organized a group of women. We called ourselves, you ready for this? Toxic Waste Women. I was gonna buy an old school bus and paint it up and we'll go give lectures. We did speak at the Common Ground Fair. They were very nice to us. My friend Ingrid did a PowerPoint presentation at the Common Ground Fair, which is documented in here. But Jenny and I were the only two. We had sample kits. Now, back in the 70s, if you wanted to send away samples of stuff, whatever you were checking on, it was a big process. Most of the labs were in California, and we were afraid to send them to the state lab because we didn't trust what the Environmental Protection Agency might do. So you had to collect the sample like on a Monday or a Tuesday to get it to the lab before it closed on the weekend. And so Jenny and I went. No cell phone, no compass. We were in an old red pickup truck. This guy said, "We'll get you, I'll get you in the backside of Farrington Mountain so you can walk in," because Farrington Mountain is guarded with guards with guns. You can't go up there unless you have permission. So he drove us to this back way that he knew how to get in there. We got out of the truck and we're walking through the woods with our samples. And I look up, and there's a guard on a tower, and he's pointing his gun. He heard something, maybe a twig snapped or something that happened, and Jenny lost her footing, and she fell. She had a bad hip anyway, and we got a little spooked. I started thinking, what was I gonna do if I couldn't carry her out? She's a grown woman. There she is, fallen, and she's saying, "I didn't get up." I said, "Push the button." Push that button. And there was the guy pointing the gun at us. Oh dear, I think we better leave, Jenny. She said, "I do too. We'll come back another day." It was another one of those, we'll come back another day, but we never did.
So that is the landfill you're talking about, Farrington
So
Mountain?
they're guarding that.
It's guarded, wow.
Huh?
They're guarding that to keep people from knowing what's going on.
Yeah.
Sure, of course.
Well, the original landfill is covered over with grass. So if you took a drone and they didn't shoot it down, from above you could see, it looks like Central Park. Beautiful grassy place there, they have a picnic, and then next to it is a landfill that's in compliance. So, is the landfill in compliance? The answer is yes. But what about the other one that's still leaching? What about that one? I don't know. Did you have a question?
No.
No. Anyone else have a question? See, when you start moving in your seats and checking your watch, it's time to move.
I swear, it wanted me to get up and, I apologize for that.
Don't, it was good.
I was also in the National Guard there in Rumford,
Uh-huh,
and we had different scenarios we'd work out solutions to year after year, and the one that always stayed there was, what if the train cars that had chlorine gas exploded?
yeah,
And that would fill up the valley,
yeah.
and there would be really little you could do about it, just, yeah.
Yeah, it's not really, when you talk about future planning, it really is an important thing for cities to think about. Yes, we have the Environmental Protection Agency, but they're like this big umbrella. They don't really, they're not involved with the down level, day-to-day operations of a town. We really should be forward thinking about planning our communities, planning safe communities, for tomorrow, for our kids, for ourselves. I mean, don't you want to walk on the sidewalks and not have to think about what you have to protect yourself from? In some ways, I oftentimes felt that I should wear a hazmat suit certain days. You probably felt that way too.
I think I did a couple of times.
Did you?
In training.
Well, I particularly enjoyed having you here, all of you, but you corroborate my book, my story. Some would say, oh, that's ridiculous that could happen. Mhm.
It's still happening.
And still happening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
So, thank you. The book sells for $20, and Forrest is ready.